how tomorrow moves yesterday.
Yeah, right.
So anyway, well, Charlie, so what I was thinking about having you do is kind of tell, I mean, we touched on it last time I interviewed you, but, just for record-keeping purposes, maybe if you want to talk about your career at the L&N, and then what the L&N meant to you, and then maybe we'll walk through, like, some of your favorite memories of the L&N,
Okay.
and then I think we'll transition to the Historical Society. Have you been with the society since the beginning?
Yes. As I say, and I brought some records out to try to find the true source of, or the real founder, and this man, Phil Ragland, who was a rail fan in Illinois. And I think in the 1970s or maybe the early 1980s, he saw that L&N was beginning to merge with other railroads, and then shortly we would lose our identity. And of course, I think if anybody who's lived on the L&N or knows the railroad and loves its tradition, really a century plus of history that was created by the railroad and its service to the South. And so I think the hope of Phil Ragland and others of us who, Ron Flannery particularly, and Charlie Bicola, we wanted to preserve that. Naturally we couldn't preserve the railroad because it isn't ours to preserve, but something of the history and something of the lore and the legends of the railroad certainly are worth preserving, and the contribution of the railroad in helping develop the South, which is exactly what the L&N did after the Civil War. We were the first railroad to operate through service from the Ohio Valley down to the Gulf Coast. Nobody else, no other railroad had achieved that. But by the early 1870s, the L&N was running into Montgomery from Louisville, and then Cincinnati, we linked up with it in 1880, I think, and then shortly, maybe 1882 or 3, the Mobile division was completed from Mobile down to New Orleans. So, in a sense, the inception of the L&N, or the system as we know it, was in place by the 1880s. And again, the company was done, I think, has been rightfully credited as really helping the South, particularly during the Reconstruction years, and bringing good transportation and assisting industries trying to get back on their feet. So there's a lot of, go ahead.
So, did you have a question? So, like when you got involved with the L&N through the magazine, the L&N.
Yeah.
And was it marketing that you originally got involved with, or public relations?
Well, I came to PR. I might give you a brief biographical sketch. Just
is good to touch on.
For starters, as a little kid, I grew up in St. James Court. Do you all know St. James, downtown Louisville? Okay. It's a community or a neighborhood probably 10 or 15 blocks south of Broadway, and it's very close to U of L and Churchill Downs. But there are a lot of old homes, and most of them date back to the 1880s and 1890s. And my grandmother lived there, my maternal grandmother. And so when my mother and father married in 1925, they moved in and lived with the grandparents for 6 or 8 years. And so I was born in 1928, August 28. I'll be 90 years old. I'll admit that, and come August the 3rd.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. But I grew up down there, and my earliest memory of trains was being taken by my mother a block or two south to what was called Galbert Street. And this is where all of the L&N passenger trains coming into the city traverse Galbert Street to get turned around or to back in to Union Station. Louisville did not have, and still does not have, well, I take that back, it did much later, a station where a train could pull in and then be serviced, passengers could board and then take off. Well, we didn't have that in Louisville. We had this Union Station, which is a stub end station, and that existed really from the beginnings of the L&N, or a facility like that, the 1850s, on up to the last train service directly into the city, which is 1976. So it's roughly 120, 115, or 120 years. So, at any rate, I grew up as a little kid down in St. James Court, which is very close to Galbraith Street. And my mother used to take me as a little boy, take me one block over to Galbraith Street, and we would see all these passenger trains coming in and out. And I'm told by my older sister that on one occasion, my mother looked at her watch and said, "Charlie, it's 4:30. We've got to get back home for supper. You have to eat supper." And I didn't want to go, and so I bit her hand. And so I was grounded for a period of time. And I think eventually we got back to watching trains. But those are my very, very earliest recollections of trains, of steam locomotives and passenger trains coming through into the city and stopping there. Well, we moved out to Crescent Hill. Do you all know Crescent Hill? Well, Crescent Hill is an eastern suburb. Charlie would be from the Highlands, which is a southeastern suburb, right? But Crescent Hill was one of the earlier suburbs as people in the 1840s, 50s, 60s began to move out of the downtown Louisville and up sort of a hilly area, kind of a crescent-shaped area, which is where the name Crescent Hill comes from. And we moved up off of Brownsboro Road, which is a street that you all may have come out to get here. But we lived there. But I went to schools, great elementary school, Emmett Field School, and then Barrett Junior High School, which are both in Crescent Hill. And I had many friends there, and so on. And I had several railfan friends, including David Morgan. I don't know if you know that name or not. David P. Morgan, who has ultimately become editor of Trains magazine. Well, his father was a Presbyterian minister, and he pastored a church on Crescent Avenue, which is right down there in the heart of Crescent Hill. So he and I became very good friends. But my, I guess, second strong memories of trains were at Crescent Hill, watching this parade of trains, passenger and freight trains, all day long. And these were the beginning years of World War II, and so there were a lot of trains. Most of the passenger trains, like, well, the Pan American, which is our crack train, L&N's top flagship train, you might say, ran in two sections. One was the main line section from Cincinnati and Louisville to New Orleans, and the other section ran to Memphis. There was so much traffic being carried on that train, mail, express, and passengers. So there were first and second 99. 99 would have been the southbound Pan. 98 would have been the northbound Pan American. So in late afternoons, the northbound Pan would be coming through Crescent Hill on its way to Cincinnati. It also carried a couple of sleepers to be conveyed by the Pensy east to Pittsburgh and New York. So here were two really good crack #1 trains, at least for the L&N, coming out, this parade of freight and passenger trains. And they would be, there's a good grade from Baxter Avenue, which you all may or may not know, down would be East Jefferson, kind of the east part of the downtown section. And there's a station which has been there since the 1880s or 1890s. It's called Baxter Avenue. More recently, the track through there was elevated, and this station was, a newer station, was placed up on the elevated section. But when you leave Baxter Avenue, the tracks begin ascending, and there's this ascent. There are level places, but there's this ascent from about 450 feet above sea level, which is Louisville's altitude, so to speak, on up to maybe 550, 600 feet above sea level at Anchorage. So the whole way up, these trains are pulling hard, and of course with steam locomotives, they were working especially hard. So it was quite a thrill for us little rail fans, or bigger rail fans, to see these crack, to us, the best passenger trains in the country coming up the hill. Both during the war, because the concepts were heavy, both trains were pulled by 482s. We called them the 400s. And they were beautiful USRA designed passenger locomotives with silver cylinder heads, silver running boards, the big L&N emblem on the cab, and big tender with the number and the name of the railroad. So it was a real thrill. We got to know many of the firemen and engineers. We'd wave at them and they'd wave at us. And then when we were old enough and permitted to go down to Union Station, we would go out to the far end of the platforms, and this is where the motive power was brought in to change engines in Louisville. Louisville was a change point for many years. And so the fresh crews getting on the engines and going to Cincinnati with the pan, we got to know. In fact, we even got to ride their engines. They'd invite us up in the cab, and we would ride the short distance out from these little servicing tracks out, and then a switch was thrown, and the engine would back in onto one of the tracks at Union Station. You know, that's 5 minutes of riding in a locomotive cab, but for a couple of young rail fans, it was heaven.
Yeah.
And then not only would we do that, we would buy a commuter ticket from 10th Street Station out to Baxter Avenue, which is 2 or 3 miles, and time-wise was about 15 minutes. And the fare, I think, was all 15, 17, 18 cents. You know, it's a commuter, so-called commuter ticket, and the L&N was still selling those, ticket agents. So again, for a bunch of kid rail fans to get on this train behind a beautiful 482 and then ride 14 or 15 minutes to Baxter Avenue and get off and watch the train set off up the hill was quite a thrill.
I wish I had a time machine.
Yeah. The other contact that I had with the railroad was through my dad, who was an officer of a lumber company. They made dimension lumber. They cut logs and cut wood to specifications for furniture. And his company was called Gamble Brothers, and it was out in Highland Park. And Highland Park is, maybe you know that name at all?
I've heard of it.
Okay, well, it's just south of Churchill Downs, but it's out on the railroad. And it's also at the south end of what was then the South Louisville Yards, big freight classification yards, and just beyond that, the South Louisville shops. So there was a lot of train movement. There were 5 tracks out there. There were tracks, the main line tracks, and then there were tracks for freight trains coming in and out of the yard. And then I think there was one so-called spur track, in which there were sidings that led off to area industries, including this little company where my dad worked. So many Saturdays I would go out with him. People worked on Saturdays years ago, at least a half a day, and so I would go out with him, and I'd sit in his car, which would be pulled up right to the tracks. That's where everybody parked, in this little office where he worked. And so I would see, again, a constant parade of trains. So I've had all of this ingraining, I guess, in my head for many years, and I guess a love for the L&N, being the hometown railroad and being also the largest railroad in the city in terms of numbers of trains coming, numbers of employees working for the L&N, and I guess the impact of the railroad on the city in providing transportation and service to many industries, many local industries. So it was a big impact. And of course, that was another exposure to me. Also, the plant, as were the other plants, there was another furniture plant, and then I think there was a plant that made asphalt and several other products. But they were all served by the L&N and by switch engines. And these little dinky 060 switchers would come in and ease into these sharp sidings and would pick up the loads or spot empty boxcars. Well, I got to know the crews of these trains. Believe it or not, one of the engineers was a man named Tom Swift. Have you ever heard that? You know, Tom Swift, not Captain America, but somebody prior to that, some comic book figure. But anyhow, this engineer's name was Tom Swift. And I met him and his fireman, whose first name was Henry. I don't remember his last name, but I would ride the switch engine, not a long ride, but I would ride in and out of our siding. So that was yet another exposure. So I guess I've had this ingraining of railroads. I went to high school for a couple of years here in Louisville, but then I went to a school in Chattanooga, Tennessee, called the Macaulay School. And Chattanooga only had 2 railroads, but boy, those 2 railroads, the Southern and the NC and St. L, really poured the trains through there I was there in the last year of the war, 1945, and then 46 and 47 when I graduated. And there was a tower at a junction where the NC and St. L and the Southern's tracks that went into the Southern's passenger station, terminal station, crossed, and there was a tower there called Central Avenue. And a man named Mark Womack, who ultimately became active in our society, and left us a lot of wonderful memories and writings about his experiences as operator and towerman and so forth. But I spent many Saturdays and many Sunday afternoons in that tower, and he was there, and then there were several other operators who were older. So, and I did have my camera then, and that's when I began shooting pictures. And so, as I say, there was this steady parade of light engines, passenger trains coming in and out, Southern, NC, and St. L, and of course freight trains. So that was yet another boost for my railfan activities.
What was the first camera you ever got?
Argus C3. My dad had an old, gosh, I guess 116 or 118. Remember the films used to, or cameras, or the film that would go in these great big cameras with bellows. Well, my dad had one of those, and I think that was probably the first camera that I had got permission to use. But then he bought me a Argus little C3, and that's what I used for, I guess, the first 3 or 4 years I began shooting pictures. And I have 40 or 50 rather faded, rather shaky shots that I took, but I mean they're valuable for the record, because here was exposed film of trains in and out of the city.
When did you first start working for the L&N? What got you involved with the L&N?
Well, very quickly I went to college, and after high school, I went to Washington Lee University in Virginia, and back then to get back and forth, we took the C&O, so that was a bit of really great train riding. And the little town where my college was situated was only 30 or so miles north of Roanoke, and you know what's in Roanoke, N&W. So we did a lot of rail fanning there, and also Clifton Forge, which is the C&O's big classification yard and a major division point. But then after, then this is also at the time of the Korean War, and everybody who could walk and talk was drafted. The U.S. suffered significant losses in the Korean War, and so the draft was instituted to replenish the supply of soldiers. So I was allowed to finish college, but then the draft board got me, and I was drafted into, of all places, the Marine Corps, U.S. Marine Corps. I was trying to get into the Transportation Corps at Fort Eustis, Virginia, and we had a Transportation Corps reserve unit at my college, and I got to know the colonel there real well because he was a real fan of sorts too, and so he told me what to do when I went through the induction center in Roanoke. Well, the day that I went through, the Marines were there, and this Marine sergeant, who was about 15 feet tall and ribbons and so forth, showed up, and he called out 25 names out of the 1,500, 1,800 people being processed that day. And I was one of the 25, and I went up to him and I said, "Sir, I think I'm supposed to go to Fort Eustis, Virginia in the Transportation Corps." And he replied, "Well, hell you say, kid, you're going with me." And I probably could have flopped on the floor and said, "No, I'm not," but I thought maybe I better do what he says. But so I did, and I became a Marine, and I was stationed at Great Lakes, Illinois, and then San Diego, and then eventually back to North Carolina. And luckily, there are railroads in all three places, and so I got in a lot of good train riding, and particularly in North Carolina, there was a little short line you may or may not have ever heard of, the Durham and Southern.
Yes, I
okay.
have.
Well, they were in their last year or two of steam, but we conned our way for many, many great cab rides with a wonderful engineer named Joseph Farthing, and he ran that 210 like crazy, and we loved every minute of it.
That's really cool.
But when I came back to Louisville, I sold pianos for a couple of years because I've always have loved music, and somebody tipped me off that that might be a nice starter for a career. But then because I stayed in the reserves, I had to. The commitment back then was you had to give the country 6 years of your time. 2 years could be on active duty, or 3 or 4 years, but then you had some reserve time. So I opted for the 2 years, and then with joining a reserve unit. So I joined this reserve unit, which is made up of mostly professional radio and TV people, and that led to for me to a wonderful career or a wonderful 5-year service with WHAS Radio and TV. I was mostly on the radio side, but I was able to cover some railroad events, rail fan events, and the L&N, one of them was the centennial trip that we ran. You probably remember seeing pictures of it, that we borrowed because all the L&N steam had been scrapped by then except for the 152. So we borrowed the 2613, which is one of the beautiful IC 482s built at Paducah, by the way. And so that engine hauled our centennial train down from Louisville to Nashville and back. We ran out of coal, but so it was said, but the 2 diesels helped us down to Nashville, and then we coaled up and made the trip back.
Was that done on purpose?
I think so. I think people suspected. We had these 2 E-units, passenger diesels, that followed us all the way down. I think it was planned.
I remember somebody telling me that story, and I was just thinking, of course the railroad would do that.
Yeah, that's right. So we pulled it off. But at any rate, the other, I guess the other project that was just taking shape then was with the General. And the L&N was invited by the Civil War Centennial Commission to participate in any way that we felt we could. And of course, by then we had merged with the NC in St. Helens and acquired all of its properties, including the Engine General, which at that time was on display. This is the, you know the Great Locomotive. You ever heard of the Great Locomotive Chase? Mm-hmm. Well, this is probably the most exciting one-day episode in the Civil War. That's this fight between the Yankees and the Confeds. You ever heard of that?
I may have heard this story.
Okay.
Yeah, they stole.
They stole the engine.
Yeah, they stole the engine and then they caught up with them eventually, didn't they?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it depends on what side of the conflict you're on. You know, either the bad Yankees came down and stole our train, or we, the Yankees, came down to liberate the South.
See, I'm a damn Yankee, but I got some Southern blood in me.
Okay. Well, anyhow,
I'm excused. I'm married to a Southerner, so.
That's sure. Well, I'm half Southern, half Northern, so.
There you go.
Yeah, so. But at any rate, the L&N was invited to participate in the Civil War Centennial. It was not to be a celebration so much; it's just an observance of the conflict, the 100-year observance of the Civil War. And so the engine had been on display in Chattanooga, but someone suggested bring the engine out, get it in running shape, and run it all across the South, and not again to rekindle animosity, but simply to show the or to suggest something of the history of those 100 years, but also to contrast the General with the modern railroad. In fact, every time the General was on display, a brand new diesel or a newer, like a GB30 or whatever new units that we were acquiring that time would be displayed with it, so you could see the contrast, a century of development, a century of modern technology. The Coach 665, which ran with the General, of course, was property of the KRM, but the KRM very generously lent the coach to the L&N. It was rehabbed at the coach shop at South Louisville, painted a bright yellow, and then inside it carried several dioramas showing first of all the chase. There were 3 segments or 3 sections of the showing this chase, but then the other part of the display showed the modern L&N, CTC. There was a mock CTC board. There were pictures and photographs of modern new equipment, freight equipment, grain cars, oversized hoppers, and so forth. And so it made a nice display, and the engine went on for from 61 to 65, the 4-year period of the Civil War Centennial observance. Ran not only all over the South, but one of the trips took it into Ohio, and of course the really key trip was to take the engine to the then New York World's Fair, and the engine was on display in New York City during the fair for about a month, I think. So then after the centennial was observed and the engine went back to Chattanooga, but the Georgia folk wanted the engine in Georgia because it came from Georgia, so that's how eventually it got to Kennesaw, and that's where it's on display. But we ran it one last trip that I was privileged to ride the engine was the IC borrowed it for the Southern Governors Convention, which met in Kentucky and met on the IC down near Barkley, Lake Barkley, and then Lake Cumberland, Lake Barkley, and there was a stretch there where we could run between the two dams. And so I went down and helped handle some of the publicity, but we ran the engine and the 665 back and forth across the two dams. And then the last day we ran as many trips as we could squeeze in for the governors, and it got to be about dusk. And the general had this big, what had been an oil-burning headlight, but there was a small little electric light that, for some dusk trips or night trips, that would be used. Well, it didn't throw out much light, but we took off from Kentucky Dam and just ran like the dickens. And I think I won't say that's the fastest that the engine ran, but I think this crew really opened up. We probably doing 35 or 40.
Under steam.
Under steam, yeah. So that was really thrilling. So that was IC's Kentucky division, and that was also the last IC steam ran on that Kentucky division. We had access to the railfan community, and also the L&N had access to the 2613 up until I think 1960. We ran, I think its last trip was Louisville to Paducah and back, a round trip, a long trip, but it was the engine was in great shape, and we went down in the morning and came back late that afternoon. So that kind of brought the close to, I would say, Kentucky Steam.
And then you got involved with the L&N's PR department.
Yeah, I was doing a lot of features with the L&N, and so one of the L&N staff had to take medical leave, and so there was an opening in the PR department, at least temporary at that time, and I figured I wouldn't be there very long, be with the railroad, and but it turned out the PR department liked what I was able to do. I mean, here I showed up, and I won't say I knew more than the staff did, but being a rail fan, you've got pretty much information about the railroad and operations and so forth. And I walked in and knew maybe as much as they did. I don't think I knew how to process copy quite like they did. It was basically a magazine and public PR operation, but I learned very quickly. But at any rate, I stayed on, and happily the man who took the medical leave came back. But as I say, the company liked, or the PR department liked what I did, so I hung around for the next 32 years.
That's cool.
Retired in the late 80s, and when I retired, we of course had gone through first the merger with Seaboard and the so-called family lines, in which these subsidiary railroads, the Georgia, ANWP, and so forth, Clinchfield, were brought into the fold along with Seaboard, and we were known first as the family lines. But then that arrangement was more formalized, and we became part of CSX in 1980. And so
originally, the family lines thing, that was kind of a marketing gimmick.
That's correct. Yeah.
They didn't actually merge.
No, we didn't merge. We kept the headquarters here in Louisville until 1981 or 1982. In fact, we had our own president, a wonderful man who had come from the Southern Pacific, Richard Spence, and he was the last residing president here in Louisville. And he went to Jacksonville, and eventually everybody here went to Jacksonville. I was very fortunate. I reported to the VP, Vice President of Public Relations of the Seaboard, a man named Ray Bullard. And I told Ray, I said, Ray, I have a media background here in Louisville. I know all of the contacts, not only in the city, but out in the state, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and I think I could do a much better job for you all if you would let me stay here. I mean, I had an ulterior motive, but my kids were in school. My wife definitely didn't want to go. So to Jacksonville, they wanted me to come down to Jacksonville. All of the departments were being merged, and consolidated into one company. But he, bless his heart, let me stay here in Louisville and finish out my career. And I think it was good in that I knew the territory up here. They didn't know if we'd had an accident or derailment, say up in Illinois, for somebody in Jacksonville to come up and cover that, which is what we tried to do in the PR department with any major story. Somebody would go to the site of a derailment or maybe a new industry or whatever. And so I persuaded Ray Bullard to let me stay, and he was very nice enough to let me do that. And so I finished out my career with the L&N in the late 80s. And getting back to what happened to the records, we had built up a very nice collection of historic records. It really was an archive of sorts, but it was a very nice collection of old timetables that went back to the 1850s, the beginning of passenger service. We had photographs. We had some of them were the early Matthew Brady Civil War pictures, but the L&N was and the NC and St. L were both photographed during the Civil War. So we had these photos, copy nags, and calendars, all the things. The magazines dated back. The first L&N magazines were published in the 1920s. We had a complete run of those, so we had really a wonderful library. But I worried that if we merged and our office was closed, what would happen to those records, and particularly if they went to Florida, they would probably get tossed. At least that was my fear. And I, meanwhile, had gotten to know Tom Owen and Cheryl McConnell at the University of Louisville Archives. And I told them about the collection, and I told them something of what I felt was my dilemma, trying to save those. And they said, we'd love to have them. And so they came down and looked through and accepted everything. We had, as I say, we had annual reports of the company all the way back to the very beginning years that the secretary and treasurer of the company had let us have and protect. So my son and I took 3 or 4 station wagon loads of records from 9th and Broadway out to the U of L, the University of Louisville Archives, which is in the Ekstrom Library building. And everything was out there. And and I thought, well, that's the last I'll see of the records, and probably the last I'll see of them. Well, I retired shortly thereafter, and I got a phone call from Tom Owen inviting me to come out to U of L. And he said, Charlie, we know that you're retired, and you probably have a little more time than you used to. Would you come out here and help us sort out all of this junk that you've dumped on us? And so that led to a second career, and that's where Charlie and I have been since then. And it's interesting that here are all these records that you might say are meaningless, and yet the inquiries, the responses we've gotten, and people, the word getting out that, yeah, there's a body of L&N records of stations, the station names of station agents, the trains that the railroad used to run, this complete run of magazines, people when they went to work, when they retired, when they died, engineering drawings, you name it. And it's a wonderful collection. And so I was invited to go out, and I've been there ever since. And I've been blessed to have some help in going through these materials. And the word has gotten out that, yes, there are surviving L&N records. And we'll often get a call or an inquiry from somebody tracing a family history. Somebody will say, well, my grandfather worked at South Louisville Shops. Would you know when he worked, when he retired, or would you have a picture of him? We didn't always come up with a picture, but we could usually pin down, when he went to work or retired. A lot of the little towns up and down the railroad would celebrate some kind of an anniversary, maybe a centennial, 100th anniversary. And so Greenville, Alabama, somebody there would call and talk to us, talk to the PR department, and they would say, well, we're having this, observing our 100th anniversary. We know the L&N has been in Greenville a long time. When did the first trains come? When was your station built? Who were the agents? Well, much of that information we still have. In station, there are little booklets called station lists. You may have seen them. And not only a listing of the station, the mileage and so forth, but who the agents were. And so, that's I think was very rewarding for a lot of these communities to be able. And then we could even go back, and if the station were gone, we could go back and look. We have a set of booklets of all of the operating divisions, 9 operating divisions, and each station on that particular division, any structure, we've got a floor plan of it. And there's usually a little notation when the station was built and if there were any improvements made. So, that's a priceless batch of information.
I wish all the big railroads had one of you.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, the fellow who really should be credited as the founder was this Phil Ragland, who then, and I guess maybe, I hope he's still living, lived up in Illinois, but he, I think, was probably on the CNEI or somewhere up there, but he saw L&N trains even before the CNEI merger, and so he, with the L&N, so he, I think, had the idea and was seeing, you might see the handwriting on the wall that the L&N would be merged into the Seaboard, and eventually Seaboard and L&N, the other holdings, would become part of CSX. And so this long history of our company would be forgotten and much of it thrown away. And I think he felt the urge, as did many of us later on, that some effort should be made to preserve that. And I think about that same era, there were several other historic railway historical organizations that were being formed. The Railway and Locomotive Historical Society is a national organization. The a couple of other groups were being formed on a national basis. NRHS was formed, National Railway Historical Society. So these were doing really good work across the country in preservation efforts. But I think they were also looking to groups focusing on particular railroads, like the Kansas City Southern or the Northern Pacific, or in our case the L&N, or in the case of the Atlantic Coastline. I think there was a society, the fellow named Lee Singletary, I think, who was active in helping start that organization to preserve the records, the lore, the history of individual railroad companies. So that's what he sensed, and I think some of the earlier officers wanted to, or we picked up the mantle, so to speak. And the KRM also began in Louisville, first as just a handful of locomotives and cars. Well, the 152 was the key piece of equipment, the steam locomotive. It was given to the museum by John Tilford, who was the president of the railroad from 1950 to 1959. And it was said that this 152, he had worked out somewhere on the line, and I guess remembered that engine, and it was a favorite of his. And I guess the engine was still operating, or had just been pulled out of service down on the south end of the railroad, where a lot of the older, smaller engines had wound up their careers, had ended their service. And so the 152 was available. The 665 had been in service on the Springfield branch, Bardstown Springfield branch. So it was available. And then a Monon caboose was acquired. So these are the first 3 pieces of equipment that I remember. And we were able to get a site up on River Road, 5 or 6 acres of land up near the what was LG&E's. There used to be a plant up there, which LG&E operated. And there was a spur that went up to serve that plant, and also the water company. And so there was a way to get equipment up there. So the 152, the 665, the Monon caboose, and some of the other pieces of equipment eventually wound up there. And the place was fenced in and was secured, and that's where we were for the first, I guess, 10 or 15 years. The one problem there, and you can imagine what that was, the high water. And I think in '64, the place was swamped. And one of our older members and a wonderful rail fan, great Frisco buff, was E.G. Baker. You ever heard that name? Yeah, well, E.G. somehow got up there on a rowboat and took pictures of here's 152, and there's water almost up to the engine's running boards. But he was able to get the pictures, and of course after the water went down, the place was a mess. But it was cleaned up. The members, and I guess with help from the park department, got the trash out. And one of the beautiful cars that was there was a Virginian private car. And do you know the name, Charlie? Well, it was a beautiful Virginian railroad office car that we got. Well, that car suffered probably the most damage, as did a streetcar that was painted, not a Louisville Railway Company car, but a car from, I think, Milwaukee or someplace, but it was painted in Louisville Railway Company colors. But those two pieces of equipment were just savaged by the water, and so they had to go. But the rest of the equipment survived and was repainted and repaired. And then in 1990, we first went out to Linden. We got out of the River Road site, and we went up to Linden for a couple of years, up on the main line, just north of Linden, almost to Anchorage. And we had a long spur that came into the property, and so there was the opportunity to run a little bit of the equipment. But some of the neighbors complained about that. And here's the steam engine being fired up on Sundays and whistles blowing and so forth. So about that time, the L&N was cutting back a lot of non-profitable or marginally profitable branches, including the Lebanon branch. And so KRM, which was fully organized then and somewhat, I won't say flush with money, but at least had some resources to be able to acquire through donation the 20 or so miles from Lebanon Junction through Boston and on over to New Haven, and then a little bit beyond New Haven. So that really was the beginning of a wonderful preservation effort to preserve not only the 152 but the 2716, which was down at KRM, the CNO engine, to bring that and some other pieces of equipment. The 770, which was the L&N's first E6 passenger unit, bring some really nice power out there, nice equipment that has been preserved, and some of it operated by KRM. That I guess that will bring you up, sort of up to date.
Yeah.
I've continued to go out to U of L because there's been this interest that I think we never expected, but it's been wonderful that they're interested in the railroad, the L&N, and its subsidiaries and its affiliations with the CSX, and the number of inquiries, the people who come up and will look through our records, tracing an ancestor who may have worked for a railroad or just want to look at pictures, So it's been a very nice piece of work that I think has been accomplished, and I'm happy to have Mr. Charles here to work with me.
Yeah. For our records, in case we need it, I know those steam trips, were those in the early 60s or the late 50s?
Well, we ran one trip that I was on and I remember very, very well, a trip from Cincinnati to Ravenna and back. It was jointly sponsored by the Louisville chapter of the NRHS and a Cincinnati railroad group, maybe the Cincinnati Railroad Club. So we jointly sponsored it, but one of the purposes of the trip was to raise money for KRM, and so the profits from the trip, and it was a very profitable trip. I think it was a 15-car train, and it was sold out. I don't know how many passengers 15 cars would hold, but maybe close to 1,000. But it was But it generated a lot of interest, and of course, as I say, it brought rail fans out from everywhere. And of course, the great drawing card or the feature was the last of the operating M1 L&N steam locomotives, the 1962, which pulled the train down to Ravenna and then back to Cincinnati, and we, which is a thrilling experience unto itself to ride behind this M1. There were 4 M1s. L&N had 42, but there were 4 engines that came in the first batch, the 1942 batch from Baldwin Locomotive, and the last fourth, 1960 to 63, were equipped with steam lines. The intention was that if they were needed for passenger service, and here they were coming in the war and with troop trains and so forth, they could be pulled off the freight assignments and given passenger trains. And several of them ran regularly from Cincinnati to Corbin on the Southland and the Flamingo. There was a wonderful engineer I had a chance to meet and interview who lived in Covington, but he was a Cincinnati division engineer, but he worked on what was referred to as the KY, which, as you know, is the main line from Cincinnati to Cincinnati, Covington, DeCourcy to Corbin, and that was his run. And his name was Chester Giesland. Everybody knew him as Chick Giesland, and he is just full of information and recollections. He was a very good writer, and during the Depression years, he was out of a job. A lot of people were laid off from the railroad, but he, being a good writer, did a lot of writing for the Cincinnati Enquirer, and so he wrote some recollections about the M1s. And he had, one recollection was entitled, and we published it in Trains, I think, "Overheard at DeCourcy." And we used a picture of the DeCourcy, inside of the DeCourcy roundhouse, and here these several M1s were there. Well, these engines, in Giesland's little story, were talking to each other. The locomotives talking to each other. And they were giving each other heck. You know, one engine would come in and grumbling about what a tough run it was, and the neighboring engine would say, "Well, you don't know what hard work is. You know, you've not pulled any coal trains. You know," back and forth like that. But it was a cute column. But he gave a lot of good lore, and much of his experiences were used in the Trains article on the M1, Big Emma. And there were several other engineers who contributed, but I think he was the guy who really spearheaded that. But he had worked out of Ravenna, and he knew that territory very well. And the M1s ran not only from Cincinnati to Corbin, but I think right after the war, the track was upgraded so that from Winchester down to Ravenna, and maybe even further, the M1s could run down there. And so that's how we were able to run this excursion in 1956 or 57, which is the...
So Ravenna, it was kind of the hub for sorting coal from all the eastern Kentucky coal mines? Yeah,
there were mine runs. Yeah, I've diverted the story, but there were mine runs that originated there and at Hazard, your part of the world. And they would run up the branches, or they would collect... there would be these mine runs that would take the empties up and then bring back the loads, and they would be assembled at several points into solid coal trains, like a 100-car coal train. And northbound, I think that was the limit, at least for steam power. And out of Ravenna, trains had to be pushed up that long hill, including across the Red River Bridge. You know, the pictures of trains pulled by M1s and other engines. Here's the lead engine, but then the caboose has got a helper cut in behind it. And so they would be pushed up into Winchester, but from Winchester down the 95 or 100 miles from Winchester north to DeCourcy was downhill, follow the Licking River Valley. And an M1 could handle a 8 or 9,000 ton train from there. But it was coming up that long grade out of Ravenna that required the pushers. And there was a roundhouse, I think a 20, 25 stall roundhouse at Ravenna, turntable and coaling tipple and everything needed to service big power like that.
I mean, your generation in particular, you have seen so much change from, you know, basically the end of the horse and buggy to the Model T right around the time you were born. And then, you know, the U.S., you've just seen such a huge transition in your lifetime. How has that been? I mean, you probably have had more of a technological advancement in your lifetime than any other generation. How has that been for you?
Well, of course, it's sad to have known passenger service and to have known the steam age, to see that disappear. I think particularly passenger service, which gave rail fans and passengers. My wife and I took many trips long after steam was gone, but we took many wonderful Western trips. I couldn't get a complete pass, but railroad employees could get what were called half-rate orders or half-rate reductions on rail trips. And so we, for many years, well, even on Amtrak, we were able to take some wonderful Western trips. And we rode the Empire Builder. We rode the Cal Zephyr. We rode the L.A. Chief and some of those trains. We've ridden trains in Canada. We also have been overseas. We went over to England in the 1960s, which is the last of steam. And we rode, I think, 15 or 16 different passenger trains, and most of them were pulled by steam engines. The Brits hung on to steam longer than the U.S. did. British Railways was still operating steam in the 1960s, and we had a field day. Wow! I got a chance to ride a high-speed British passenger train pulled by a high-speed Pacific type, and boy, that was wonderful. And so I guess I miss that. But on the other hand, I think it's thrilling to see what is developing, particularly in Europe, what has developed, and I'm just hoping that some of that will come to the U.S. Now we do have the Acela trains. I've not ridden one yet, but I would like to ride the Acela.
Get them out there.
Well, I had sort of an advantage in that my wife's father. My wife was not from Louisville. She came from a little town in West Tennessee. You may or may not have ever heard of it. Union City. It's down. Have you ever heard of Reelfoot Lake?
Is that in Illinois?
No. It's a very western part of. Yeah, right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a very western part of Tennessee. It's Union City, and it's just off the IC's main line from Chicago to New Orleans, and the GM&O, the old GM&O and the IC both ran through or near there, and then the NC and St. L had a branch that came up from Nashville and Brewston there. So there were a fair number of trains. But anyhow, my wife's father, my father-in-law, was an attorney, but he also represented all three railroads there in that county. So she was exposed to trains, and she had ridden trains. So we were married down there, and I was thinking, well, we agreed that New Orleans would be a wonderful place to spend our honeymoon. How do we get to New Orleans? Well, the wedding, the service, and the reception were planned for 6:30 or 7 o'clock at the Presbyterian Church there in Union City, where her parents had served and were members, and it's where my wife grew up. So we got married there, and we had the reception in the basement, and then we went home, changed our clothes, and her parents took us up to Fulton, which is, you may know or you may not know. Fulton is just south of Paducah, but it's on the main line, IC main line. Well, by happy happenstance, the southbound Panama Limited came through about 10:30 at night, so everything was scheduled. The wedding, the reception, change clothes, get up to the station, catch the Panama Limited. That was the order of business that day. So we took the Panama Limited to New Orleans. Our first marital dispute in our 55 years of marriage was who's going to sleep in the upper and who's going to sleep in the lower. It was Burrs in the Pullman. And two people could sleep in a lower, but it's not very comfortable. But so I think we flipped a nickel, and she got the lower, but I got the upper. And you get a better ride in the upper because you're higher and you get a little swaying, but it's really more comfortable because you're not over the wheels. But anyhow, we both got a good night's sleep, and then we were in New Orleans for our honeymoon and came back. But she's been on many rail trips with me, and she's enjoyed it. She's not a rail fan, and she will never be one, but she has, number one, this family background, and then having been married to a crazy rail nut, why she and taken many trips, she's been very patient, but the only thing that scared, one quick little anecdote, we were on the Canadian, is it Canadian National or CP that runs the Canadian? What would that be, CP or? Well, anyhow, one of the.
I think it's Canadian National.
Okay, it's a through.
Oh wait, no.
It's
Well,
a
it has to be the CP.
yeah, it's a through.
Their slogan.
It's a route. Well, from Halifax west all the way across Canada to North Vancouver, and we went eastbound. We went up, flew up to Seattle, and then we went from Seattle to Vancouver, and we rode the. I can't think of the little railroad that runs up that the coast. But then we came back and caught the eastbound Canadian all the way. We were on the train for I think 2 nights and 2 days, and we had our own bedroom, upper and lower, and it could be made up during the daytime for a lovely occupancy. But then we had our own little bathroom with a little shower, and the shower drained down onto the tracks. And the first night we were on the train, we both wanted to take showers, and I took mine, and she went and took hers, and I heard a scream. I said, "What's the matter, Katie?" And she said, "Come in here and look." Well, the shower drained right down on the tracks, and there was a grating. It was very safe. She wasn't going to fall through, on the tracks, but she couldn't get over the fact that the train's moving at speed. you see the cross ties going. She said, "What's going on?" And I said, the shower water drains down the tracks.
That's awesome.
But
That's
so
a funny story. Well, thanks for the interview.